Hey everyone, Elena here. Revenge is where we tell stories that leave you stunned. If you're here for that kind of drama, hit subscribe and let's get into it. I stood frozen in my $40 Target dress. The same one I'd worn to 3 different weddings because my parents always insisted that contributing to Melissa's emergency fund mattered more than buying myself something new. 200 people filled the grand ballroom of the Westchester Hotel, and every single one of them turned to stare. At the head table sat Melissa, glowing in a brand new Chanel gown. Dad had bought it for her last month, right after she got fired from her 4th marketing job in 2 years. Then their accountant Gerald Thompson stepped forward. His face had gone pale. "Dr. Rivera," he said carefully, "I need Catherine's signature to release the foundation funds for the Harrison Medical Wing expansion. The wire transfer is scheduled for Monday." Dad waved a dismissive hand without even looking at him. "She's not involved in foundation business, Gerald. You know that." Gerald hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Sir, she's listed as co-signer on the operating account. The $4.2 million transfer can't be released without her authorization." The ballroom went completely silent. You could literally hear the ice melting in the crystal glasses. My parents turned toward me at the exact same time, like synchronized mannequins whose programming had suddenly glitched. "Since when?" Dad asked, his voice dropping into that quiet tone he used right before losing his temper. For the first time in years I met his eyes. "Since 2019, I said calmly. "When the IRS flagged your account for suspicious activity. Remember? You said it would look more legitimate if your CPA daughter's name was attached." Mom's champagne glass trembled in her hand. "You never mentioned that." "You never asked," I replied. Then I turned back to Gerald. "I'll be in your office Monday morning at 9 to discuss the Harrison transfer," I said. "We should also review the foundation's expenditures from the past 6 years. I've noticed several transactions that raise questions." And with that, I walked out of the ballroom in my Target dress while 200 wealthy donors whispered behind designer napkins. Let me rewind for a moment. My name is Catherine Rivera. I'm 31 years old, a certified public accountant specializing in nonprofit fraud detection. My parents usually introduce my career the way people apologize for a fast food job, quickly, and with a tone that suggests no one should ask follow-up questions. My father, Dr. Marcus Rivera, founded the Rivera Medical Foundation in 1998. By 2024, it controlled $47 million in assets and funded a dozen research programs across 3 states. My mother, Patricia Rivera, was the executive director, which basically meant she hosted galas and approved expenses. And Melissa, my younger sister, held the title of Community Outreach Coordinator, a role created specifically for her. It paid $120,000 a year for roughly 11 hours of work each week. Meanwhile, I lived in my parents' basement. Not because I had to. 3 years ago, Mom called me crying about a financial crisis. The foundation was facing an audit and they needed help organizing the books. "Just for a few months," she said. "Maybe 6. I moved in to help. Within weeks, I uncovered $340,000 in unexplained transfers, vendor invoices that didn't match bank records, and credit card charges from luxury retailers categorized as medical equipment. I spent 14 months reconstructing their financial history and installing systems to prevent future discrepancies. They never said thank you. Mom simply said I could keep living in the basement since I was already there. Dad said it looked better for compliance reviews if the foundation's CPA lived on site. The house they sold last week, the one in White Plains worth about $600,000, had actually been left to me by my grandmother in 2018. I'd planned to renovate it this year. Instead, I recently discovered my parents had quietly transferred the deed into a trust they controlled and sold it without telling me. The buyer closed escrow on Thursday. Melissa needed the money. It was her 3rd rehab stay in 18 months. Dad explained all of this to me Friday night the same way someone might describe fixing a leaky faucet. "We'll reimburse you from the foundation," he said casually, "once the Harrison donation processes. Probably by Christmas." The Harrison Medical Wing expansion, the foundation's $4.2 million contribution toward a new pediatric research facility. My parents' legacy project. And the same operating account they'd made me co-sign back in 2019, when the IRS started asking questions about whether foundation funds were being used for personal expenses. Monday morning, I arrived at Gerald's office at 8:47 a.m. I brought 4 banker's boxes and my laptop. Gerald looked like he had aged a decade over the weekend. "Catherine," he said nervously, "your parents called me 16 times. Your mother even showed up at my house yesterday. Did you give them what they wanted?" I asked. "I can't," he replied helplessly. "Not without your signature." He pointed to the screen. "The operating account requires dual authorization for any transfer over $100,000. It's been that way since the 2019 compliance review." Then he sighed. "Your father set it up himself." I placed my laptop on his desk and opened the first banker's box. "Then we should review these before I sign anything." I opened the first banker's box. Inside were 6 years of credit card statements, wire transfers, vendor invoices, and expense reports. I'd spent the entire weekend in that basement bedroom, the one with the water-damaged ceiling they never bothered to fix, building a detailed timeline. As I walked Gerald through the records, the color drained from his face. First item: $67,000 in American Express charges at Bergdorf Goodman, labeled promotional materials and donor gifts. Every purchase had been shipped directly to Melissa's apartment. Next, $34,000 at Canyon Ranch Spa Resort, categorized as executive retreat and strategy planning. Mom and Melissa had gone 4 separate times in 2023. No board members attended. Then there was $89,000 paid to Prestige Auto Leasing for Melissa's Range Rover, classified as a foundation vehicle for community outreach. I slid another document across the desk. $120,000 in salary payments to Melissa. My calendar audit showed she averaged 2.3 hours of work per week. Then the one that made Gerald's hands start shaking. $156,000 in cash withdrawals, labeled petty cash for operational expenses. No receipts. No documentation. And that was only the beginning. Page after page showed foundation money quietly funding my parents' lifestyle and Melissa's addiction. Gerald flipped through the files like they might burst into flames. "Catherine, if the IRS sees this..." "They will," I said calmly. "These are IRS Form 4941 violations. Excess benefit transactions between a nonprofit and disqualified persons." I tapped the spreadsheet on my laptop. "The penalty is 25% of the excess benefit, plus another 200% if it isn't corrected. Based on my calculations, your clients, my parents, are looking at roughly $1.2 million in penalties." I paused. "And that's before we discuss potential criminal charges for wire fraud." Gerald swallowed. "Your parents could go to prison." "Yes," I said quietly. "They could." At that moment my phone rang. I declined the call. It rang again. Declined. Then Melissa called. She left a voicemail that was nothing but sobbing and the phrase, "You're killing me," repeated 7 times. Gerald stared at me. "What do you want to do?" "I want you to call your contact at the IRS," I said. "Agent Morrison, the one who handled the 2019 review. Tell him I have documentation of ongoing fraud at the Rivera Medical Foundation and I'm requesting an immediate audit." Gerald looked stunned. "Catherine." "Then contact the New York State Attorney General's Charities Bureau. They should know that a foundation receiving state grants has been systematically misappropriating funds." He leaned back in his chair. "Your parents will lose everything." I held his gaze. "They already took everything from me." My voice stayed steady but the words had weight. "My house. 6 years of my career. I turned down a partnership at Morrison and Associates to clean up their mess. Every holiday. Every birthday. Every weekend spent fixing their books while they told people I was helping out, because I didn't have much going on." "And my grandmother's house?" I said quietly. "Sold to fund Melissa's drug habit." From the bottom of the box I pulled out one final document and slid it across the desk. "This is my formal resignation as co-signer on all Rivera Foundation accounts. Effective immediately." Gerald stared at the page like it might explode. "I'm also filing a complaint with the New York State Bar Association," I continued, "against the attorney who notarized that deed transfer without my knowledge or consent." I closed the lid on the banker's box. The Harrison Medical Wing will not be built with stolen money. I stood up and gathered the files. You have until Friday to freeze all foundation accounts and notify the board that the foundation is under investigation. I walked toward the door then stopped. If you don't, I said without turning around, I'll assume you're complicit and include you in my whistleblower report. Gerald had gone even paler. I had no idea the extent of this. You're the accountant, Gerald, I replied. It was your job to know. I opened the door then paused. For what it's worth, I believe you missed it through incompetence rather than malice. I looked back at him once. Cooperate fully with the investigation and you might keep your license. My parents arrived at Gerald's office 12 minutes after I left. I know because I was sitting in my car across the street. Dad stormed inside first, his face purple with rage. Mom followed, clutching her Birkin bag like it was armor. They came out 23 minutes later. Mom was crying. Dad was shouting into his phone. Probably their lawyer. I started the engine. Then I drove straight to the FBI field office in White Plains. Special Agent Rebecca Kwan listened to my presentation for 90 minutes without interrupting. I had come prepared. On the table in front of her sat a 40-page report, fully indexed and cross-referenced. It included bank records, internal emails, and board meeting minutes. Documents showing my parents voting themselves salary increases while simultaneously telling donors the foundation was facing budget shortfalls. When I finished, Agent Kwan leaned back in her chair and studied me. Miss Rivera, she said, why are you bringing this to the FBI instead of handling it through civil channels? Because my parents have been defrauding federal grant programs. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. The Harrison Medical Wing expansion includes $1.8 million from the National Institutes of Health, I explained. NIH grant number R01CA234567, awarded in 2023 for pediatric cancer research infrastructure. I slid another folder across her desk. I have evidence they plan to divert $400,000 of that federal money to pay my sister's credit card debt and lease her a new apartment in Manhattan. Agent Kwan's expression hardened. That's wire fraud and theft of government property. Yes, I said calmly. It is. I opened the folder. These are emails between my parents and their contractor discussing the diversion. She scanned the highlighted message. My father had written, take the federal money for legitimate construction costs. Bill us privately for the inflated amounts and return the difference in cash. Below it was the contractor's reply agreeing to the arrangement. Agent Kwan looked up at me. You've been sitting on this for how long? I discovered the scheme 6 weeks ago, I said. I needed time to gather complete documentation and make sure the evidence would withstand legal scrutiny. I held her gaze. I'm a CPA, Agent Kwan. I know how to build an audit trail. For the first time she smiled slightly. I can see that. There's one more thing. I pulled out the final exhibit. My parents forged my signature on the deed transfer for my house. Inside the folder were the notarization documents and a signature comparison I had prepared, complete with authenticated examples of my real signature from bank filings and my CPA license application. The notary listed on the transfer is Sandra Chin, I explained. She's my mother's college roommate. I've never met her. Agent Kwan flipped through the pages. That's notary fraud, forgery, and real estate fraud. Yes, I said. The buyer had no knowledge of the forgery. I confirmed that independently. But my parents knowingly defrauded me of a $600,000 property. She closed the folder and looked directly at me. Miss Rivera, I have one question. Yes. Did you do anything illegal while gathering this evidence? No. I kept my voice steady. I had legitimate access to all foundation records as co-signer and as the person who rebuilt their accounting systems in 2021. Every document I provided came from files I was authorized to access or from public records. I paused. My parents also gave me their email passwords in 2022 when they asked me to manage correspondence during their vacation in Tuscany. They never changed them. You documented everything, she said slowly. Yes. But I never altered or destroyed any records. He studied me for a moment. You've been documenting your parents' crimes for 6 years. I documented discrepancies and compliance violations, I corrected gently. I didn't understand the full scope of the fraud until recently. Once I did, I made sure I had proof. Agent Kwan stood and extended her hand. I'm going to bring in agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the NIH Office of Inspector General, she said. This will become a multi-agency investigation. She paused. Are you prepared for what that means for your family? I shook her hand. Agent Kwan, I said quietly, they stopped being my family when they stole my house to fund my sister's cocaine habit. I'm prepared for them to face the consequences of their choices. The raid happened Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m. 15 federal agents executed search warrants at 3 locations: the foundation offices, my parents' house, and Melissa's Manhattan apartment. I know the exact time because Agent Kwan called me at 6:30 a.m. We're executing warrants in 17 minutes, she said. You're not under investigation, but I wanted you to hear it from me before it hits the news. I was already awake. I'd been awake since 4 a.m. I was sitting in the same basement bedroom, soon to be my former basement bedroom, surrounded by the boxes I'd packed over the past 3 days. When the raid started, my phone exploded. At 7:03 a.m., Dad called 9 times in 4 minutes. Mom left a voicemail that was nothing but screaming, raw, panicked, completely incoherent. Melissa sent 47 text messages. They escalated quickly. What did you do? You ruined everything. I hope you die. And then suddenly, please Catherine, please. They're taking everything. Please help me. I blocked all 3 numbers. Then I got in my car and drove to my old office at Morrison & Associates. My former boss, Janet Morrison, looked up when I knocked on her door. Catherine, she said, surprised. I thought you were still on family leave. I'd like to talk about that partnership offer, I said. She leaned back in her chair. Is it still available? Janet studied my face for a long moment. It is, she said. What changed? Everything. I sat down across from her. I can start Monday. She opened a drawer, pulled out a contract, and slid it across the desk. I've needed you for 3 years, she said with a small smile. Welcome back. The indictments came 6 months later. My father was charged with 18 counts: wire fraud, theft of government property, and tax evasion. My mother faced 12 counts as a co-conspirator. Melissa faced 4 counts tied to the contractor kickback scheme. Apparently, she had been far more involved in the fraud than even I had realized. Their attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal that included restitution but no prison time. The U.S. Attorney's Office refused. At trial, prosecutors entered my documentation as evidence, Exhibits A through DDD. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Then they returned guilty on every count. My father was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. My mother received 5 years. Melissa got 3 years, later reduced to 18 months after she agreed to enter intensive rehabilitation. The Rivera Medical Foundation was dissolved. After stripping out the fraudulent transactions, about $12 million in legitimate assets remained. The court redistributed those funds to legitimate medical research organizations. The sale of my grandmother's house was voided. I got the property back, along with $200,000 in damages from my parents' estate for the fraudulent transfer and emotional distress. A week before sentencing, my parents' attorney called me. Your mother would like to speak with you, he said quietly. She says she's sorry. I paused. Tell her I accept her apology. Then I added one more thing. Tell her I hope she uses her time in prison to reflect on why she chose a daughter who stole from her over the daughter who saved her from worse consequences. The lawyer was silent for a moment. That's remarkably cold, Catherine. No, I replied calmly. It's remarkably fair. If I hadn't reported them when I did, their accountant eventually would have. And his way would have been worse. How so? My father still has his medical license when he gets out of prison, I said. If the medical board had discovered the fraud first, that wouldn't be the case. I let that sink in. They taught me everything I know about conditional love and transactional relationships, I continued. I'm simply applying their lessons. Then I hung up. I looked around my new apartment, a quiet 2-bedroom in Scarsdale, purchased with my partnership bonus and signing bonus from Morrison & Associates. No water-damaged ceiling. No stacks of fraud evidence. No parents who saw me as a convenient tool. Melissa tried to visit me last month after her release. I didn't answer the door. She left a note under the mat. They blame you for everything, it said. But I know it was my fault too. I'm sorry. I kept the note. Not because I planned to forgive her, but because it's the first time anyone in my family has ever admitted that their choices had consequences. My grandmother's house still stands in White Plains. I renovated it last fall. New kitchen, restored floors, and a garden planted where her roses used to grow. I don't live there. Instead, I rent it to a family with 3 kids who needed a fresh start after their own difficult circumstances. Sometimes I drive past. I'll see the children running across the yard where I used to play 25 years ago. Back when my parents still pretended to be proud of me. There's one thing I never told them. By reporting the fraud when I did, I actually saved them. The contractor they bribed had already begun cooperating with state prosecutors in a separate construction fraud case. The New York Attorney General's office was preparing RICO charges. If that investigation had broken first, my parents wouldn't be serving 8 and 5 years. They'd be facing 25. They'll never know I protected them, even while destroying everything they built. And that's fine. Some lessons don't need to be spoken out loud.